They didn't avail themselves of the important work done by particularly the Democrats in the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the work done on the Office of Special Plans that was preparing false intelligence for the Bush administration that could have been refuted in terms of the evidence that wasn't there for so-called links between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. And finally, a very important work that was done on intelligence reform was done by General Brent Scowcroft that was completed before the 9/11 Commission even began its work, and this work wasn't used. Finally, since I'm virtually out of time, let me just say one thing about conflict of interest. There were too many cases within the Commission by Commission members and staff members, particularly the staff director, Philip Zelikow, where people had to recuse themselves because of their own conflicts. I'm not in a position to get into all of the various conflicts, but the fact of the matter is this was known before these people were even appointed. And this should have been grounds, just as Henry Kissinger eventually had to resign as chairman of the 9/11 Commission because of his own conflicts of interest. They shouldn't have gone ahead to name those people who couldn't even take part in the serious work of trying to understand what happened on 9/11 and how do you reform the intelligence community. But the most important individual to me, other than a commissioner, was the staff director, Philip Zelikow. And his conflicts of interest were so great that you do have to wonder why this individual was appointed to head this important staff of over 80 people. He had very strong ties to the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, very strong personal and political and policy ties to Condoleezza Rice. But more importantly, Philip Zelikow was running the case study program at Harvard, which took millions of dollars from the Central Intelligence Agency over a 10-year period to write case studies on the CIA, to establish a record that was essentially untrue with the facts about the work of the CIA. And of course, the classic case study that Philip Zelikow chaired, along with Ernest May, who was his patron at the Harvard Kennedy School, was the case on the Soviet Union, how the CIA got it right, the politics of getting it right. And of course, as we all know, one of the greatest disasters of politicization of intelligence that occurred even before the Iraq War was over the politicization of intelligence on the Soviet Union. And who did Philip Zelikow bring in to the staff structure as a team leader on his staff? None other than Douglas McKacken, who was serving a tour up at the Harvard Kennedy School. And who was Douglas McKacken? Douglas McKacken was the head of the Soviet analysis shop during the 1980s, who was responsible for most of the politicization of intelligence. So here you have Philip Zelikow from Harvard and the case study program, and Douglas McKacken as a team leader on Zelikow's staff, making serious decisions about the need for change within the intelligence community. My last word is what this study is all about and what this process is all about is how do you regain integrity within the intelligence community, and how do you regain integrity with an investigative process such as the 9/11 Commission. And ultimately, that's not about changing structure, it's not about changing systems, it's not about changing organizations. It's about appointing people to important positions who have the nerve and the courage to tell truth to power. And that's what's missing from our government at this particular juncture.
Thank you, Mel Goodman. We're going to move now to our question and answer period. Again, we will ask for one question from, excuse me?
I was going to read what David McMichael said. I was going to read the civil eminence name.
No, we're going to do that.
Oh, okay.
We got it under control, John. That's why I'm sitting on top.
We are going to entertain questions from our questioners, one question each, and we'd like for you to raise questions about the whistleblowers that have been ignored in the absence of David McMichael being a member of the panelists, and we would invite our panelists, John and Mel, to address that issue. So let's reverse the order and begin with Representative McKinney, and then we'll go to Ray McGovern.
Thank you very much. Again, I have a comment, and that is, it seems that I seem to have to say the same thing over and over and over again. And that is Washington, D.C. seems to be the only place where you can make repeated mistakes at the job, on the job, at the workplace, and get a promotion. Now, I don't understand that. The average person goes to work, they wake up every day, and if they're late 5 days, they get docked their pay at least, or they may even get fired. So my question to the panelists is, what does the fact that we have seen promotions instead of punishment for failure, what, if anything, does that tell us about the policy that these people who were promoted were carrying out?
Well, let me make one observation about that. We all know about the famous remarks George Tenet made to the president. That will be his epitaph, that if the president wanted intelligence on Iraq that would help him go to war, that would be, quote, a slam dunk, unquote. The CIA could get him any kind of intelligence he wanted, which is exactly what the CIA then did. George Tenet, when he left the government 6 months later, received the Presidential Freedom Award. When we finally get our hands on the CIA accountability report, and I think one day we will, and we find out the individuals who made the major errors, the major blunders, including people such as George Tenet, we're going to find a list of people who've been rewarded by the system. There's no doubt in my mind about that. I don't know it for a fact, but I can bet on it because that's what happened during the 1980s. The people who had the worst track record on the intelligence on the Soviet Union were rewarded through the system because the system wanted to paint the Soviet Union as 10 feet tall to justify Reagan's defense budgets that were at record levels for peacetime in the 1980s. The lesson from all of this, and it's a very serious lesson, is this kind of behavior, this kind of activity creates cynicism in a society. And it creates cynicism particularly among our young people. And when you have done that, when you have created cynicism and you turn people off to the important work of government and public policy and public service, you've really discredited yourself and you've really harmed the nation. And this is what I worry about.
Okay. Ray McGovern, did you have a question for our panelists?
The comments by Laurie Van Aken on all the whistleblowers who were ignored, her litany of, she must have mentioned about 12 of them, I think just stands and speaks for itself. Sibel Edmonds, who was here just a minute ago, is sort of the arch example of that, testified for 2.5 hours. Not a word of her testimony appeared in the final 9/11 Commission report. I would like to turn again to the composition of the commission and ask Mr. Goodman about the two chairmen. We've talked a little bit about Governor Kane, but nothing's been said about Lee Hamilton. Now, Lee has been, like many of the other commissioners, sort of anointed for the last year, virtually, well, almost canonized, I'd say beatified, you know. They've all been treated with great deference, and yet we hear from Laurie's very, very concise wrap-up this morning how they missed the ball on so many things. Lee Hamilton, in my memory, has a rather checkered career on commissions like this and in responsibilities such as this. I'm thinking Iran-Contra, for example. And I think that to evaluate his, quote, impartiality, end quote, one has to see or to take a look at how he functioned during Iran-Contra. Would any of you have any recollection of that? Or?
Well, actually, I do, but here is where I beg to differ, and this is my personal disappointment with Lee Hamilton. Lee Hamilton did excellent work during the Iran-Contra investigations, and I remember when he made a series of statements. I was teaching at the National War College in the late 1980s, and I made them required reading for the 150 military officers who were at the National War College. And to me, pardon the expression, he was my great white hope on the 9/11 Commission, because you knew that Governor Kane really had no background whatsoever to deal with this, and there were very political types like John Lehman, Slade Gordon really did not belong on that commission. He performed poorly as a member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in the 1990s. But Lee Hamilton understood these issues. So my real regret is, where was Lee Hamilton during all of this? My other problem with both the co-chairmen, Kane and Hamilton, is both said publicly, not in the report itself, that there was enough evidence that was accumulated, enough intelligence accumulated before 9/11 to prevent 9/11. Nowhere does the committee reach that conclusion. And actually, to be fair to some of the staff reports, there were 17 or 18 of them, and I'm very critical of the media community for not analyzing those staff reports. They were all on the Internet. All you had to do was go to the 9/11 Commission website and analyze them. The staff commission, or the staff studies of the commission, came closer to raising serious issues of accountability and blame than the final report did. So the final report, ultimately, is a cover-up. I don't know how else to describe the final report. And here, my great regret is Lee Hamilton didn't exercise the kind of stature he has as a man of integrity.
I would just note that at a public meeting where the family members were demanding that Philip Zelikow step down as a director, Governor Keene responded to their concerns by saying that he was aware, and the commission was aware, of the conflicts with Mr. Zelikow. In fact, he and one of the commissioners, Jamie Gorelick, had to testify to their own commission, and he said that Zelikow had recused himself at certain points in the investigation. And then he paused for a second and he said, as all of us will have to recuse ourselves at some point. So that's the commission that's looking into it, a commission that every member of which has some conflict serious enough to recuse themselves. And but that's the dilemma, is how do you get somebody far enough outside the system to look inside the system or be allowed to?
In fact, one of the family members, Bob McIlvaine, whose son, Bobby McIlvaine, an assistant VP of media relations at Merrill Lynch, who died on September 11th at the World Trade Center, would like to make a comment on that. We're joined on the dais by Mr. McIlvaine.
Yeah, Ray, you took some of my talk away when you mentioned Hamilton. But, John, I think you remember after the joint congressional investigation, when the Blue Book came out, and David Patorti, I'm a member of September 11th Family for Peaceful Tomorrows, and we went to talk to Lee Hamilton. And I'll never forget this, and the Jersey girls were there, and David and I, and we were talking about the 28 didactic pages of the Blue Book, the first commission. And he said to us, he says, well, as much as I would like that information to come out to the public, because of national security, I just couldn't allow it. Now, I spend my whole life researching. That's all I do. I don't know if I'm going to be able to write a book or what, but going back to Iran-Contra, it was absolutely phenomenal. He practically made the exact same comment on the commission of the Iran-Contra, when to me, there's a lot of people that should have been put in jail from that. It's the highest level. Yet he came out with that same statement, because of national security, we can't release certain information. And that bothers me. Now, that really angers me, but it's just, I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Bob. Our next questioner, Wayne Madsen.
Well, I'd like to keep this theme going because this was my question before your comments. It was on what we now know Mark Felt told Woodward, when you follow the money, you'll get at the root of all these scandalous operations. My question is, do you have a sense that when Bush first nominated Henry Kissinger to be the chairman, and then he stepped down because of conflicts of interest, and then they put Lee Hamilton on to take the place of George Mitchell, who also had conflicts of interest, that there was a conscious decision not to have this commission look into the money going back to the funding of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan? We could roll in BCCI, we could roll in Iran-Contra, and the fact that a wonderful former member of the House, chairman of the House Banking Committee, Henry Gonzalez, the late Henry Gonzalez, always expressed frustration that he got no cooperation from Lee Hamilton, the head of the House Intelligence Committee at the time, or I should add also from the the person on the Senate Banking Committee that was looking into these issues, Senator John Kerry. He said he wasn't getting much help from. But so my question is, we heard about the mysterious stock puts that when I went to one of the news conferences, Hamilton said, I reject the premise of your question, even though Governor Kane said it was still on the table to investigate that. I don't think it ever was. These were the stock puts on United Airline, other stocks before 9/11. The fact that Paul O'Neill, the Treasury Secretary, had gone to the United Arab Emirates and been briefed on suspicious money movements through the UAE Central Bank in Dubai. He was, to my knowledge, they didn't talk to him. Riggs Bank's involvement in the Bosnia Defense Fund, we know money bled into Al-Qaeda units operating in the Balkans. Then, so with all this information, was this just a stacked deck against looking at what Mark Felt said to Woodward, follow the money, that they would not follow the money?
Well, let John, I think, talk about the money issue. Let me just say one thing about the commission. The president didn't want the commission. The Senate Select Committee for Intelligence didn't want the commission. The House Committee on Intelligence did not want the commission. The first commissioner name was Henry Kissinger. Now, I have great respect in some ways for Henry Kissinger. But any of those who've read his memoirs know that this is not a person who looks for the truth from documentation. This is a person who uses documents to put the best face on an issue and really to sing the praises of Henry Kissinger. And I wrote an op-ed immediately after this appointment was made that this sort of gives away the game. There's no way they're going to get to the bottom of the 9/11 Commission because they're going to appoint the kind of commission that just won't go there. So if you look at the people who were selected and the way they were balanced off, 5 Democrats against 5 Republicans, an inexperienced governor from New Jersey, and a former congressman from Indiana who apparently was not up to it or did not want to apply the rigor that was needed, and look at the commissioners themselves, I think they got the product they wanted, which is to stay away from personal involvement, accountability, bureaucratic cowardice, and particularly what the White House knew and when it knew it and how much information did it have. You know, one thing that comes out of the staff reports that doesn't come out of the commission report, if you compare the work the Clinton administration did before the Millennium Crisis and the spike in intelligence material and how active the administration was to gather together the intelligence community and to pursue every lead and to stay on top of this situation, then look at the next spike in intelligence reporting on terrorism, which was the spring of 2001, when nothing was done. Important positions went unfilled, particularly at the Pentagon. Rumsfeld didn't want to talk about terrorism because he wanted to deploy a national missile defense system in Alaska and California that doesn't work. And you had a national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, who wasn't keeping the president up to date and wasn't checking on how the bureaucracy was performing on this very important matter of terrorism, as Richard Clarke was trying to communicate to her. So they got the report they wanted by appointing the commission that they felt they needed to appoint, which is classic for if you look at commissions in the history of Washington politics. That's how you, as you say, stack the deck.
I'll just say in the interest of time, you'll hear about the money in the other panels in great detail.
Okay. While we are in this segment on whistleblowers, we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge the presence of Sibel Edmonds, who has joined us here. If you could just... Sibel, many of you may know, is a former FBI translator who gained prominence when she went public with information that suggests that the U.S. was warned of the impending attacks, using airplanes as missiles to attack buildings within the U.S. Thank you, Sibel. Our next questioner, go right to Mike Rupert.
Professor Goodman, you and I will forever and strenuously disagree about a couple of things, one of which is your statement that these were blunders and they were personal and not institutional. I I will go to my grave, and I believe my book documents an irrefutable case that the mistakes, quote unquote, made were deliberate, intentional, and they were both personal and systemic. You made a brief reference to Pearl Harbor, and there's a book by, and I've butchered a couple of first names. I got the last names right today, but Stinnett, I believe his first name is Richard, Day of Deceit, with a FOIA release of documents showing that we had broken the Japanese codes prior to Pearl Harbor, knew the attacks were going to take place, and allowed them to happen. I go further with respect to 9/11, arguing that we facilitated the attacks. We'll never agree on that, and I stipulate
Never
that,
will
but
agree on that.
Wanted to say that. Perhaps we can agree on something. You talked about the deliberate slanting of intelligence, and I'm well familiar with DCI Gates, who was a DDI, I believe, under Bill Casey, Deputy Director of Intelligence. But from Richard Helms all the way through George Tenet, there have been allegations and records indicating that intelligence has been slanted for political purposes. I think we can agree on that. Looking at the 9/11 Commission, the Kane Commission, with these abundant conflicts of interest, I'm particularly taken aback within the last week seeing now this startling new evidence that Iran had something to do with 9/11 after seeing 20 to 40,000 Iraqi civilians killed in a what I think is a useless invasion of Iraq, too many deaths of American service personnel. How, in your opinion, was the spin placed or the intelligence placed as a result of these conflicts of interest in the Kane Commission to produce a political result, and what political results have come as a result of the Kane Commission that were purely political?
Well, this afternoon I'm going to be talking about the reforms that stem directly from, I think, the ineptitude of the Commission, because these are reforms that will not help the intelligence process. Let me say one thing about the intelligence reforms. If you look at the reforms of the 9/11 Commission, would any of those reforms prevented the misuse of intelligence and the politicization of intelligence that were used to lead this country into war? Not one of them. If you look at the reforms, would one of those reforms prevent another act of terrorism? No, of course not. So this is what I worry about, and I share your concern there. My problem is I find that most charges of conspiracy from my 42 years of federal service are really dealing with problems that are what the British call cock-ups and not conspiracy. And I think serious mistakes were made. I don't think they were willful in the case of 9/11 any more than they were in the case of Pearl Harbor. But this is no time to be debating that.
Thank you very much. We want to go and thank our panelists as we move to our next panel discussion, which is omissions and errors in the Commission's final report. We'd like to invite Paul Thompson, John Judge, Nafez Ahmad to the table.
Panelist John Judge has submitted for the record a list of national security experts who were censored by the 9/11 Commission, and this will be available for the record, on the record.
While we're waiting for our next panelists to take their seat, I'd just like to announce that today's briefing has been co-sponsored by Representative Raul Grijalva of Arizona, and we thank him for his participation as well. Also, if we made an announcement earlier, and I guess this is the part where I have to have egg on my face, because we announced that there was going to be lunch for everyone. Unfortunately, there's just lunch for the family members and the panelists. So if you were hanging on for more than just food for thought, I hate to be the one to have to break it to you. But food is available downstairs as well. We'll begin our next panel discussion. Our next panelists are, one moment please, Paul Thompson, who is the author of Terra Timeline. Just one second. Paul is a freelance researcher and is the creator of the Center for Cooperative Research's Complete 9/11 Timeline, a compilation of over 5,000 articles and reports on 9/11. In the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, Thompson found himself poring over news of the attacks on the Internet and growing increasingly frustrated with how incomplete the story of September 11th was. He began gathering and condensing every credible fact on 9/11 and posted these facts online in chronological order to build a terror timeline. Paul?
Thanks. I want to start off on my discussion about the FAA and NORAD response on the day of 9/11 with a quote from Senator Mark Dayton. Last year he read the 9/11 Commission report and he was quite outraged. And let me tell you what he has to say. He said that NORAD and the FAA have covered up, quote, catastrophic failures, unquote, that left the nation vulnerable during the 9/11 hijackings. Quote, for almost 3 years now, NORAD officials and FAA officials have been able to hide their critical failures that left this country defenseless during 2 of our worst hours in history. NORAD officials lied to the American people, they lied to Congress, and they lied to your 9/11 Commission to create a false impression of competence, communication, and protection of the American people. He calls NORAD and FAA failures, quote, the most gross incompetence and dereliction of responsibility and negligence that I've ever, under those extreme circumstances, witnessed in the public sector. Now, what exactly is he talking about? What are these failures that were so grave? Let me just start real briefly in mentioning what was happening before 9/11, what standard procedure was. NORAD, if you don't know, that's the military organization that defends the skies over the U.S. And the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, they had established standard procedures for air traffic controllers to contact NORAD whenever civilian planes strayed from their prearranged flight course or when they lost contact with air traffic control. When NORAD was contacted, they would typically send a fighter up to intercept whatever the problem was with the plane and figure out what was wrong. And then there would be a graduated response. First they might tip their wings, they might look into the cockpit and try to figure out what the problem was. Now NORAD claims that at the time of 9/11, the fighters on alert had up to 15 minutes to get airborne. And in fact, it just so happened that there were military exercises that were taking place that day, and they say that because of that exercise, the response time was more like 5 minutes. So within 5 minutes, they could have gotten the planes up into the air. Now this was, contrary to what some people say, this was actually an extremely common and standard procedure before 9/11. And it did not require White House approval. People would just make the decision on the spot in NORAD. For instance, in the year 2000, there were 425 unknowns. Pilots who didn't file flight plans, or they diverted from the flight plans, or they were using the wrong radio frequency or something of that manner. In many cases, the issues would get quickly resolved, but in that year, fighters had to take off and investigate these unknowns 129 times in the course of the year. So we see that what was supposed to happen on 9/11, which was that the fighters would get up very quickly, actually happened on a very regular basis, a couple times a week before 9/11. But what's strange, and what Mark Dayton is making reference to, is that there are all these conflicting accounts about what happened and how quickly the fighters responded. And I actually count 5 major accounts of what happened that day that are in serious conflict with each other. Originally, in the days after 9/11, right after 9/11, Richard Myers, the acting Joint Chief of Staff, Chairman, a NORAD spokesman, New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, they all said that there were no fighters launched on the morning of 9/11 until after the Pentagon was hit at 9:37. But then just days later, on September 18th, 2001, NORAD put forth a timeline. They released a timeline that was significantly different. They said that fighters had been ordered to launch 45 minutes earlier than their first account. And then in May 2003, NORAD officials, prominent officials, testified under oath before the 9/11 Commission, and they put forth yet a different timeline that had many different numbers about what happened and when it happened. And then in January 2004, there was a book put out by the military called Air War Over America that had, yet again, very different account of what happened and when it happened. And finally, the fifth timeline that we come to, the fifth account, is put forth by the 9/11 Commission in June and July of 2004. And this one is probably the most conflicted of all. It's almost a complete rewrite of what happens with the hijacked planes and the response from the fighters. So there's all this confusion. And I have very limited time here to talk about this. This is a very complicated issue. So what I decided to do was, rather than go in depth about or try to cover all 4 flights, I'm just going to focus on one of the flights, and we can use that as a case study to really see what was indicative of all the flights. So I decided to focus on Flight 77. And let me just give you some brief information about what happened there. So Flight 77, a problem began on that flight at 8:56 when the transponder signal was turned off. So there was no longer a radar signal except for the primary kind of backup radar signal. And at the same time, radio communication with the air traffic control stopped. So by this time, one of the planes has already crashed into the World Trade Center. Some of the other planes are missing. So certainly this would be evidence that a plane has been hijacked, at least to strongly suspect that. However, the 9/11 Commission says that the air traffic control, which was the Indiana-based Indianapolis Air Traffic Control Center, when they got this information, they no longer have the transponder signal, they no longer have contact, but they don't tell anybody about this. That's what the 9/11 Commission says. But there's a lot of problems with this. For instance, from other accounts, we know that within minutes of the plane disappearing, American Airlines headquarters was notified, according to newspaper reports, and even the testimony of some people from American Airlines. And then according to the New York Times, the National Military Command Center, the NMCC, located in the Pentagon, was also notified, just within minutes. This is what you would expect, that notification would be going out. But in fact, what the 9/11 Commission says is they say, for some reason, the Indianapolis Flight Control Center assumed that Flight 77 had accidentally crashed into the ground. They're not even thinking about a hijacking. And so, in response to thinking about an accident, they contacted the West Virginia State Police and asked if there were reports of a downed aircraft. They contacted Air Force Search and Rescue Unit, asked them to look for downed aircraft. And they contacted the local FAA office. And that's all they contacted. They didn't contact NORAD. We talk about the standard procedure of 129 times happening when you lose contact with the plane. Just as a matter of course, you send a fighter up to see what happened. For some strange reason, the 9/11 Commission is saying that didn't happen. In fact, 9/11 Commission claims that not only they didn't contact NORAD, they didn't contact FAA headquarters, they didn't contact FAA Command Center, which was responsible for the day-to-day operations of the whole air traffic system. They didn't even contact the neighboring flight control centers to see if any of them had spotted the missing plane. So then at 9:05, the plane reappeared in the airspace managed by Indianapolis, allowing them to realize the plane had turned around and was headed east towards Washington, D.C. And we even have the American Airlines headquarters claiming in testimony to the 9/11 Commission that they had been told the plane was turned around. But the 9/11 Commission says this isn't so. And then I find this quite incredible. 9/11 Commission claims it wasn't until 9:20 when Indianapolis communicated with the FAA Command Center and notified them that Flight 77 is missing. And then the information started to get out to other command centers, but still NORAD wasn't notified. Nobody told we're talking over half an hour later, the plane has been missing, still no one notifies NORAD, until finally 9:34, 3 minutes before the plane crashes, and then it was only mentioned inadvertently in passing when talked about something else. So in order for this to be true, the 9/11 Commission is making the claim essentially that the Indianapolis Flight Control Center and the local FAA center that they contacted were in complete lack of contact with the outside world during this time, that they were unaware, unlike the tens of millions of people who'd been watching CNN, that there was an ongoing crisis, that planes had crashed into the World Trade Center, 2 planes. They're saying that all the way until 9:20, there's been over half an hour now, this has been the breaking news, that nobody in this entire Indianapolis Flight Control Center or the FAA Center had any idea that any of this had been happening. And we know that just isn't true. In fact, there was one news report saying that other centers such as theirs had been notified of the crisis long before the first plane even crashed into the World Trade Center. So what we see is an account coming from the 9/11 Commission that, in my opinion, is just frankly impossible.
1 minute.
And I could go into a lot of length, unfortunately I'm out of time, about the fighter response, but we see all kinds of similar anomalies that really don't stand up when you look at them logically. According to what the 9/11 Commission says, there was no plane that actually no fighter that actually came to Washington to defend Washington for this plane or any other plane until about 10 o'clock. It was really remarkable. I mean, this plane was missing at 8:56, and nothing was done to defend Washington. No plane arrived for over an hour.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Our next speaker, Nafiz Mossadegh Ahmad, is Executive Director of the Institute for Policy Research and Development in London, England. He is the author of the recently published book, The War on Truth, 9/11, Disinformation, and the Anatomy of Terrorism, which deconstructs the findings of the 9/11 Commission report and investigates the worldwide web of terrorist networks across space and time. Good morning, Mr. Ahmad.
Thank you. The title of my section is Suspects and Plots, Osama bin Laden and U.S. Intelligence. So I'm going to try and present a number of important facts and reports that fundamentally challenge the official account of the nature and identities of the alleged 9/11 hijackers. Very briefly, though I won't be able to cover everything at all, but their relationship to Al-Qaeda and their activities as Islamic extremists. While I won't offer a kind of alternative theoretical explanation, it must be noted that the facts I'm going to refer to constitute as yet unresolved anomalies that strike at the core of the official narrative espoused by the 9/11 Commission and other previous inquiries. A variety of reports from reliable accounts, journalistic investigations, eyewitness testimonials provide a very bizarre picture at odds with the conventional portrayal of the 9/11 hijackers as Islamic fundamentalists. 2 key hijackers, for example, Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Shahi, are known to have visited the Woodland Park Resort Hotel in the Philippines several times between 1998 and 2000. Numerous local residents and hotel workers, according to the International Herald Tribune, recognized them from news photographs after the event. They reportedly, the report says, they drank whiskey with Philippine bar girls, they dined at a restaurant that specialized in Middle East cuisine, and visited at least one of the local flight schools. Al-Sheikh himself, through several parties with different Arab friends, they drank alcohol, they had lots of big vehicles, they had a lot of money. And there are a number of reports like this. They spent time with the girls, the chambermaids, and so on and so forth. General kind of activity is not commensurate with this kind of strict Puritan Islamic ideology of Al-Qaeda. And there are many reports of this nature that I'm going to briefly give you. U.S. investigators have said that the 5 of the hijackers, including Atal al-Shahi, there are others, Nawak al-Hamzi, Ziad Jarrah, and Hani Hanjour, they visited Las Vegas 6 times between May and August 2001. According to the San Francisco Chronicle, for example, they, quote, engaged in some decidedly un-Islamic sampling of prohibited pleasures in America's reputed capital of moral corrosion, unquote. The activities included drinking alcohol, which is strictly prohibited in Islam, gambling, the same, and visiting strip clubs. And I could go on. I don't want to repeat the kind of reports that are available, but suffice to say that the number and consistency of the reports is sufficient to conclude that this is true. These guys were basically not acting at all in accordance with the kind of traditional requirements of Islam. Just to give you an idea, I have a quote from an expert. His name is Mahmoud Mustafa Ayub. He's a professor of religion at Temple University in Philadelphia, and he specializes in Islamic and Middle East studies. He said, it's incomprehensible that a person could drink and go to a strip bar one night, then kill themselves the next day in the name of Islam. People who would kill themselves for their faith would come from very strict Islamic ideology. Something doesn't add up here. Just to give you a kind of deeper understanding of what we're talking about, I mean, Al-Qaeda is basically a radical tendency within a broader Islamic movement known as the Salafi movement, which originates today in Saudi Arabia. It's derived from the Arabic term salaf, which means to precede, and refers to the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. And the general idea is that you have to very strictly follow the precise behavior of the Prophet. If you go outside of that boundary, you're basically exiled from the religion. You cannot call yourself a real Muslim. So the fact that these people were behaving in this way is very, very bizarre. And that's one element of the picture that I want to give you. What was their connection to Al-Qaeda? How were they connected to Al-Qaeda if they were behaving in a way which was supposedly completely at odds with Al-Qaeda traditions? Moving on from there, another very interesting phenomenon which needs to be acknowledged, and which the Commission report simply doesn't look at in any detail at all, is how these Al-Qaeda operatives were able to go in and out of the United States without any kind of sanction at all from the immigration services. There was a very interesting report by Joel Mowbray from the Conservative National Review. And what he argued, and he interviewed a number of State Department officials who worked in the he worked with visas and in consular affairs. And what he concluded was that expert analysis of these visas, the visa application forms of 15 of the 9/11 terrorists, showed that all of them among the 15 reviewed should have been denied visas under then existing law. It wasn't that the law was a problem and that we need to tighten the borders. It was that the law simply wasn't applied. 6 separate experts were interviewed by Mowbray. They analyzed the simple 2-page form and they came to the same conclusion. All of the visa applications they reviewed should have been denied on their face. And he catalogues some of the glaring problems with the visas, and he says even an untrained eye would be able to look at this and say this is impossible to allow these people into the country. And the very odd thing that I'd like to draw to your attention is I have a statement from a guy by the name of Michael Springman, who was chief of the U.S. consulate in Jeddah, and it's been confirmed that 15 of the hijackers, I believe, or perhaps the number is 13, I can't quite remember, but at least 13 of them obtained visas to the United States from the U.S. consulate in Jeddah. Now it's interesting because according to Michael Springman, who used to be head of the visa bureau in Jeddah in the 1980s, he said that he had been protesting to the State Department that the CIA, according to him, was using the U.S. consulate in Jeddah to grant visas to unqualified applicants from all over the world, basically to recruit mujahideen in the Afghan war. And what Mark Springman subsequently said in the aftermath of 9/11, that he's worried, after hearing these reports, that this pipeline wasn't closed up. And this is what he said. He said this in an interview with, I believe it's CBC Radio in Canada. "I had not been protesting fraud. What I was protesting was in reality an effort to bring recruits rounded up by Osama bin Laden to the United States for terrorist training by the CIA. The State Department did not run the consulate in Jeddah. The CIA did. Of the roughly 20 Washington Dispatch staff there, I know for a certainty that only 3 people, including myself, had no ties to any of the U.S. intelligence services." So that is an issue that the 9/11 Commission has simply just not dealt with in sufficient detail. The other issue I want to bring up is the issue of military training. There are many reports that came out after 9/11 that many of the hijackers received U.S. military training at installations in the United States, which required a certain degree of security clearance. The reports came from Newsweek, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. 5 of the alleged hijackers, for example, it's been alleged, received training in the 1990s at secure U.S. military installations. These included, according to Night Ridder News Service, Mohammed Atta had trained at the International Officers School at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. Abdulaziz Al-Omari had attended Aerospace Medical School at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas. Saeed Al-Ghamdi had been to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. And there are others, apparently 4 of them trained at the Pensacola Naval Air Station. And there are many other reports of this nature. Now, when this actually came out in the press, obviously there was a big kind of hullabaloo. How did this happen? And Senator Bill Nelson actually faxed the Office of the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, and he demanded to know, is this true? And September 17th was when he made contact, and he asked the Pentagon, can you confirm or refute these reports? Now, by September the 21st, Senator Nelson was informed that the FBI could neither say yes or no, according to his press office. Apparently, the Bureau was still investigating any connection to the military facility. Now, a pioneering journalist by the name of Daniel Hopsicker, he's a former producer at PBS Wall Street Week, and former investigative reporter for NBC News, he contacted Senator Nelson's office a month later, and he wanted to know precisely what was going on. And they said that the FBI had said that they are trying to get through something complicated and difficult. And this was several months after this happened. Now, Hopsicker wasn't satisfied with this, and in the end, he spoke to somebody at the Department of Defense and really pushed them. And in the end, the spokesman admitted, I do not have the authority to tell you who attended which schools. It's a very significant statement because it confirmed that somebody did attend schools, but we just don't have the authority to tell you. And again, this is an issue that the 9/11 Commission simply has not looked into. To give you one more thing, I mean, the other issue I wanted to discuss, but I won't be able to discuss in any detail here, is the extent of the surveillance of almost every one of the hijackers by the intelligence community. I mean, the evidence on the public record, I discussed this in my book, The War and Truth, it shows that every single hijacker was, for at least a year to more than a year, under the surveillance of the U.S. intelligence community and often many other intelligence agencies. And despite that, despite some of them being known to the intelligence community, they were still able to come into the United States. I will only give the example of Mohammed Atta. We have confirmation that Mohammed Atta was on a terrorist watch list since 1986. He had been implicated in a bus bombing in Israel. And now this is very strange. If he was on a terrorist watch list since 1986, it should have been, he was able to come in and out of the United States. What his visa in particular was, had expired. Before he came in in January 2001 for re-entry. He was in violation of his visa status. Somehow he was allowed in. And why wasn't the screens flashing that this guy is a confirmed suspected terrorist? And I guess I will close. I don't want to go into too many details and take too much time. I will close just to give you an example. Is the conventional narrative tells us that Muhammad Atta was not extensively surveyed once he had entered into the United States. I found an interesting